Welcome to Mintel's Little Conversation podcast.
Welcome to Mintel's Little Conversation, where our experts bring you fresh ideas and new perspectives on how consumers eat, drink, shop, groom and think. Each episode features a discussion of current topics from the latest consumer trends and new products to shifts in markets and lifestyles. I'm Andrew McDougall, Director of Beauty and Personal Care at Mintel, and today we're discussing Mintel's beauty and personal care trends for 2023. So I'm very excited to be joined by some very esteemed colleagues and members of the global beauty and personal care team. Delighted to have a trends veteran, two trends veterans with me today. But first of all the way from the US, we have Sarah Jindal. Hello, Sarah.
Hello.
Welcome to the podcast, and I'm also very excited to also announce Vivienne Rudd is on the pod with us today. So welcome, Vivienne.
Hello.
Welcome both. I know that we have a lot to talk about with our 2023 beauty and personal care trends that have been launched, and it's always a difficult one onto where to start. I figure a little bit of background of the trends. They are the result of workshops comprised of our whole global team of beauty and personal care analysts around the world. We all make these predictions. They're all supported by consumer data from 36 global markets, all the product launches that we have in the global new products database, and evidence from our whole suite of data science and analytic tools available, as well as some brilliant minds like yourselves today. So without any further ado, I want to kick off that trend discussion. We have to start somewhere. So what I wanted to do is start with the drivers, the consumer drivers that we see, and then how that's leading into sort of the three trends that we will discuss today. And the first one I picked out was our beauty RX trend, but I wanted to focus just first of all on the health and well-being driver, or the sort of the physical pillar of the sort of health driver, and the impact that's having in beauty. Is there something in particular that either of you have seen in this space that is particularly interesting for the beauty market?
I mean, there's a ton, honestly. I think the challenge is kind of narrowing in on one particular thing, but I think what I always find really interesting is this relationship between the physical and the mental. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the next trend, but there's definitely some overlap there. And one thing that we were talking about recently is just this sort of information overload that we're all subjected to from a million different, sources, and how that leads to a lot of mistrust and sort of confusion. And so that's where, with this particular trend, Beauty RX, we start to talk about the importance of the right information and presenting it in the right way for consumers so that you can sort of reignite that trusting relationship between brand and consumer and get them to purchase the right product to meet the right need, but doing it in a way where they actually believe what you're telling them and they're comfortable in that information and in that purchase.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think you can link that with the rise of the sort of the informed influencer as well. So that although, you've still got your celebrity influencers and your TikTokers, etc., there's a real growing appreciation of people that have actually got the scientific credentials to back up the beauty advice. I'm thinking about the likes of Lab Muffin, for example, who's so great at transmitting really good information and advice on skincare that's backed up by science and is truly credible. And I think you see it as well in the pushback against some of the new brands that are being launched because they've got maybe some celebrities behind them in the headline ingredient, but there's nothing else that actually gives it credentials. And people are being much more critical in the way that they're taking advice.
And we talked about this. Beauty with a Brain a couple of years ago, the rise of sort of expert-led influencers like derms and that sort of a thing. But I think that sort of content has become so popular on platforms like TikTok that the consumer is now sort of primed and looking for sort of that next level of information, which just creates a perfect environment for brands to really start digging into the sort of the science behind everything that they're doing.
Exactly, which is also fueling the rise of dermacosmetics. And I know that, again, that's something we've been tracking for a number of years, but you really do see an explosion now of skincare brands and scalp care brands that are really tackling solid issues rather than just saying, it's going to make your skin feel comfortable. It's about making your skin feel comfortable and be totally healthy. And that's why we're seeing so much M&A activity as well around that derm space. And, just in the last couple of months, a whole load of anti-acne brands being bought up by bigger, sort of more mainstream, broad-based beauty houses.
Yeah, it's really interesting because that whole trend is kind of like before the health pandemic, not to relate it all to that, but before the pandemic, we saw a lot of the sort of the derma care brands, and skin health was becoming quite a key focus for a number of the big brands and a lot of smaller brands coming through. But it really accelerated over the last couple of years for people looking for those particular solutions. So it's interesting now that we're sort of plateauing a bit in sort of the sort of the post-lockdown, not post-pandemic, but post-lockdown world, to now see these the real focus on skin health and scalp health and all the health aspects really interesting to look at. But more so than just having the derma claims, or as you say, the influencer-led sort of commentary on, this product is, dare I say, clean, in inverted commas, and things like that. But it's actually, consumers are actually looking more into these claims. They actually want to know more from the brand. And I find it fascinating. I know we have some consumer data from this year in the US that showed that beauty users of online content, they use TikTok primarily. I think 2/3 of them use it primarily because it's entertainment, obviously. But interestingly, 4 in 10 use it because it's educational. And I think that shows where particularly younger consumers, but we are seeing a lot of beauty consumers are going online. They are getting that information from the online space. So my question here is that where validation and proof of claims becomes really important and forms a big important part of this beauty RX trend? Because it is true that people are going online for that information, and it is a great source of information. However, there is also that sort of dark cloud of misinformation that could be out there. There has been the mistrust in sort of what people are saying online anyway. So is that something as well that we're seeing coming into the beauty space in this beauty RX trend as well?
Yeah, I mean, definitely it's this pairing of not just here's an ingredient and here's how it works, but how does that tie into the claims that this product is making? And then what's the validation to show that it's actually performing in that way? I think with everything that's going on now in terms of the economy, we need to start thinking about what value actually means to consumers. And I think especially when you're shopping in the sort of skincare category and you're looking for things because you've got acne or eczema or dark spots or whatever the issue is that you're experiencing, if you're on a budget, or now you're painfully aware we're coming into the cold weather, energy costs are rising, et cetera, et cetera. People are really starting to pay attention to where they're putting their dollars or pounds or whatever. And so I think really thinking about what this idea of value means, especially as you're shopping in those categories, it's not just about, pennies per ounce that you're paying for that product. Is it validated? Does it make sense to me? Is it giving me the information that I need to know that I'm putting my money in the right place and I'm actually going to get the results that I'm expecting to see? So yeah, I mean, I think it's all intimately, integrated, and you've got to paint that fuller picture. I don't think it's as you were saying, it smells nice. That's not necessarily going to warrant that purchase. It's got to do the job that you're looking for it to do.
Yeah, and I think that aligns with what's going on with the development of home testing kits as well, where, you've got these tests for the sake of argument for your microbiome, and you can track the progress of, your microbiome over time to see if the products that you're using are working or not. And we've been talking about that again for a few years as a possibility, but now you are starting to see that with test kits going into retailers like Target, for example. But it's still at a nascent stage, but it's only going to get more sophisticated over time. And then it's going to borrow from, as Beauty RX suggests, it's going to borrow from the medical community and start using those kinds of tests and those kind of metrics in the future.
You've actually done my segue for my next question perfectly there, Viv, because now it's the case of, what is in the future? Because, you've helped massively.
Nice job.
It's perfect. I'm loving it. But no, that was going to be my next question on the future, because you mentioned obviously looking at medical science. I always find it fascinating to see what's happening in medical journals and happening in medical research for the idea of sort of, we can 3D print organs and things like that. And it's kind of, that just, for the skin, that obviously has huge implications for our industry further down the line. And you mentioned the microbiome testing there as well. I know that there are companies such as Shiseido, which are already looking at DNA testing and rolling that out at a consumer level. So the future for sort of personalization, health and beauty, that's going to be really interesting. I mean, maybe I'm not talking about the near future per se, but that evolution of that development that we talk about in this Beauty RX trend is going to be really interesting to see.
Well, you mentioned Shiseido, and I think it's them as well that's starting to do research into looking at the bacteria on the surface of the skin. And so that's really interesting because, again, that becomes almost like a fingerprint where those colonies of bacteria, I know it sounds disgusting, but it's a fact of life. We've all got it. But the sort of makeup of that bacterial population on the surface, that sounds bacterial population. I like that. On the surface of the skin
I can see another trend emerging.
I know, is unique to that individual. And so it sort of paints a picture of what's going on that exact person's skin. And so I could very easily imagine that becoming a great sort of segue into building these sort of, I won't say customized or personalized, because I think we've gone beyond that. I think it's individualized is really the way that we'll start sort of talking about some of this stuff in the future. Obviously not in the next couple of years, but really looking at these, if you pair sort of, like you were saying, Viv, microbiome, bacterial populations, genetic predispositions for skin issues, skin cancer, hair loss, whatever it might be, you can then create this, blueprint, I guess, for what your skin and hair and what have you are going to do as you move through your life, and be able to kind of target that maybe at different time points. Who knows?
Yeah, it's quite interesting when you look at sort of what's going on with food and drink technology and some of the healthcare technology, and seeing, in terms of DNA testing and optimization apps as well that measure hydrogen and methane levels in your breath even, and then it sort of tells you what ingredients you need to rebalance the system. You can sort of see how there's kind of learnings to take from there into advanced beauty testing as well.
It's really interesting to sort of see, as I say, how that future of personalization and sort of individualized solutions is going to be sort of going forward. As you say, something that I think is evolving. So in the next couple of years, we're going to begin to see those steps being taken before, so some of the things we're talking about are much more sort of in the future kind of things. But changing direction slightly, so still sort of maybe keeping with well-being and personalization that we've discussed, but looking at sort of the psychological well-being sort of pillar, so thinking more about mental health, as well as thinking about the identity driver. How are these impacting beauty more? So stepping away from just that beauty RX trend, but thinking more about those trends around individualism and mental health and what that means in beauty. What are the sort of the key themes you're seeing that impact in particular ways?
I think representation is probably the biggest place where we're starting to see greater demand from consumers, but also a bigger shift on the sort of brand and retailer side, but still with a lot of space to grow. And we can talk about that from the perspective of the wellness movement in general. And I think we hit on this in our trends a couple of years ago, where we basically were like, the wellness space is for white people. And how do we make that accessible for everybody? Because it's not just about, rich stay-at-home moms. It's for everybody. And I think our sort of, even though this conversation has been growing and evolving for many years, I think the last few years have really sort of exploded that conversation from the perspective of everyone has a stake in what's going on with their own identity and how that impacts them from a mental well-being perspective. And so now the drive is for these brands that are kind of catering to those wellness sort of areas to do it in a way that's accessible for everybody. And I think that that sort of representation and expanding that conversation, and also just being open about the ideas that you're talking about and where those come from, certain ingredients or ancient traditions, like being very open about, what you're building off of for your brand. I think that becomes part of that as well.
Access becomes a really important part when we talk about representation as well, doesn't it? That providing that access to information, to everything, to giving people, it's not necessarily that every consumer is going to want the same playbook from brands, but it's just that idea that there needs to be that sort of open access available. And that, as you say, representation forms a big part of that, because I need to feel involved in that messaging, or at least feel like I was part, like not me personally, but obviously someone like me was being thought about in the development of this product. And I think that is going to be this next evolution of the wellness sector, like you say. And that brings us on nicely to our second trend, which is that evolved self-care trend, which is all about sort of mental health and wellness, what this means in beauty, body positivity, things like that. As well as obviously the communities as well that we sort of live in within beauty. Again, what are you seeing sort of in these? Is there anything sort of exciting you're seeing in this kind of evolved self-care space? Or is there any particular way that you see this evolving going forward?
I think it's interesting looking at the body positivity space in particular, because we're seeing more representation in terms of advertising imagery, but I don't see the representation in terms of product creation yet. And I admit that it's a bigger leap between imagery and functionality rather than, fashion. It's much easier. So at the moment, it's just, yes, we are talking to you and you and you and you, but we're not formulating for you. And I wonder whether that's the next step, because that's the step that's been taken now with menopausal beauty. We've seen big strides with that. Quite how long-term successful it's going to be, who knows? That's still up for grabs. But we've not seen anything for fuller figured men and women yet, and the issues that they face, which is going to be difficult tonally anyway.
Yeah. Well, and also people with, limited mobility or any sort of mobility issues. This is something else that we talked about a few times over the years in different contexts. But I think that also needs to be, like you were saying, are these products being developed with me, quote unquote, me in mind? And I think that's a big population that often feels as if they're not considered when people are creating product. So I think that becomes an important part of it. And the whole menopausal thing, you took the words right out of my mouth, but we're starting to talk more about, life stage, tying products to life stage and the sort of hormonal journey. And it's not just menopause, it's pregnancy, it's, the whole thing. I think that there's almost this self-awareness, I think, that we're sort of missing in the category, if that makes sense. And I think that that's a direction that we need to move to in the future, is just being more conscious that all of this is not just about me, it's about everyone else as well. I think we've been extolling the virtues of like one size fits all doesn't exist for years. And in this context, it absolutely needs to move beyond any sort of a one size fits all option and really start to think about specific groups of consumers and the needs that they have.
It's interesting because the way the both of you speak there, it's almost like we've reached this say-do gap with it, which I know we talk about with the, but it's really interesting. And that's not to say this is a bad thing, because I do personally believe that beauty has always played very well in sort of the diversity and inclusion space in terms of talking about it. And I think it's good I think in those regards, sometimes it's good to have a tick box exercise where you are ticking things off, saying, yes, we're talking about this, we're talking about this, we're doing this, we're showing images of this. I think that's all good because it's the first step. However, it's the next steps that come that are then the really important ones. Right. And that's where I think...
And do we get to where we are now and stall out?
Exactly.
Do we keep progressing?
What are the next steps? And I think you have to be careful with those next steps as well, because you mentioned the menopausal. I think hormonal sort of hair care and skincare is something we're looking at quite a lot over the last couple of years. And I think this is a fascinating area as well, because you also need to be careful again that you're not just, it's not just about, okay, again, tick boxing to be like, okay, do I have a hormonal line? Do I have a menopausal line or a pregnancy line? Or even just a young person's life stage menstrual cycle line or something along that sort of concept. It's much more about why do we have that line? What is it actually bringing to the consumer? Rather than this, again, it's good to tick box to get through the door. But once we're through that door, why are you here?
Well, it's like, are you just, and we've seen this with so many brands over the last couple of years, it became like a buzzword exercise where they were like, oh, wellness, that's the next big thing. So let me write this Instagram post and throw the word wellness in there. But really, it's got nothing to do with my product. And we've seen so much of that over the last couple of years that I think people are now starting to sort of take a step back and look at that wellness space and that the language around it and start to decipher, does that make sense or does that not make sense? And I think we're at, like you said, we've reached this sort of turning point where we need to stop just saying it because it's what everyone else is saying and it's what consumers expect us to say, but actually evaluate from like the DNA of your brand, is this a direction that it makes sense for you to move in, and why? And make sure that you're doing it authentically. Because people see right through the BS, I think.
Oh, yeah. But it also loops back to Beauty RX with the whole validation thing as well. So,
definitely.
You have got some brands that are coming through and they have wellness-related ingredients that they say will raise your serotonin levels or your dopamine levels. And there are ways that they're sort of starting to test it out by showing, centers of the brain that are lighting up when they're using it. And that could be something that could become quite important going forwards as well. And it also links to, you were talking, Andrew, about wellness for all, not just for me, it's for the we. And there's this kind of sub-trend of altruistic beauty of kindness. I saw a stat from British Research Institute showing that there's an actual rise of serotonin levels when you have an act of kindness either given to you or you give an act of kindness to someone else. And I think a beauty brand, really picks on that very beautifully is Beekman, that actually says it's all about kindness. It actually has kindness listed in its inky list of ingredients. And, you might be cynical about it, but I think it's actually a really pleasing way to market yourself.
Yeah. No, I like that. It's true. I think we've spent, so much time just thinking about me, but there are huge advantages to thinking about the wider community around you. I mean, and we saw so much of that, like during COVID and during lockdowns, where neighbors took care of each other and, did all these wonderful things to help each other out. And it feels good to do that. Like you said, there's this, a serotonin rush when you do something nice for someone else. But I think considering the world is a dumpster fire at the moment, the only way forward is going to be for people to hold each other up, or it will all just continue to fall apart. I know that sounds very doom and gloom, but it's kind of the truth.
Yeah, and I think that is going to have to be the next evolution. So, as you said, I'm very glad you said about sort of validation as well earlier on there, Viv, as well, because that's obviously, I think that has to be there for the wellness sector or the wellbeing sector, particularly in beauty, to have any sort of credibility going forward, to build any trust with consumers. We do need that. And I think it is going to be fascinating because we are going to see, we touched upon sort of menopausal and sort of hormonal solutions in beauty, those for sort of disabilities or mobility challenges as well. But it's also going to be important for stress management, which, mentioned post-pandemic, stress management, thinking about sleep, blood circulation. Again, we've seen a lot of sort of claims around that could potentially be developed. So that could be very interesting. And the other great point I think that you mentioned there, Sarah, which I wanted to mention as well, was this idea of the importance of community and how that is continuing to grow, because we want to connect with like-minded individuals. We want to feel like part of the collection. And being an individual and being part of a group, they're not polar opposites. So it's not like you're in one camp or the other. It's not like I'm just me or right. I'm following the herd. It's kind of no. It's good to play in those spaces. So I think that's a really important message as well. And again, for mental health, for mental wellness, that becomes really important because your mental health is about you as an individual, but your community and who you can speak to is how, as you mentioned with the kindness, that's how we can sort of get through it. So I think it's really interesting to see how beauty companies are already playing in that space. And I think going forward, we see in person, but also online communities building around beauty. I'm thinking of the Lions Barber Collective, who famously trained all their barbers to be counselors. And they now have a non-fungible token, the NFT, which allows you to join their Discord online, which is a community, again, which is allowing men to speak with each other in this digital community. And I think That's a really interesting sort of way of looking at sort of the self-care, mental health, wellness side of things that I think is really important. And it also then, very fortunately for me, ties us into our next trend as well, of thinking of the third trend we have is the new rules of engagement. But thinking about how we're going to be engaging with consumers in the future. If the last couple of years has taught us anything, it's that we have to be flexible, we have to be adaptable, but also it's not always going to be, again, there's not one solution that's going to work all of the time for everything, and particularly in beauty, we're a tactile industry. We're going to need the in-person and the sort of online. So I think the new rules of engagement trend as well is also really interesting to think at from an experience driver as well going forward.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, by the way, you're the king of segues. I love it. But I know, you think we planned it. I think the challenge is going to be building an environment across multiple realities so that you can service your consumer in whichever place he or she feels comfortable, whether that's in a store, in the metaverse, on a chat bot, or through some gaming platform. You know, you've got all of these things that are available to you now, and it doesn't have to just be about one or the other. I think that, you know, brands and retailers can really start thinking about building these environments so that if I want to go into a store one day, I can do that. If I want to go online the next day, all my preferences are there. I could potentially chat with the same advisor that I talked to in person in the store, you know, building it in the seamless way so that you can just sort of do whatever you feel like doing in that particular day and still have the same sort of level of access. Because one of the things that we've definitely learned, especially during the lockdowns when stores were closed and you couldn't physically go in and you had to do everything online, the convenience of that has stuck with a lot of people. So now that physical retail environment has sort of the responsibility to really find what they are at this point, because going in just to pull a product off the shelf, I can do that on a website and have it on my doorstep tomorrow. I don't need to get in my car or get on the bus to do that. So what does the storefront become? And I think that's where the experience and the experimentation, and, you know, all of the engagement opportunities really come into play, whether they're tech driven or not. I think that there are ways to do that aren't necessarily, you know, married to technology, but the tech then also gives us those additional layers that allow us to build that environment out even further.
Yeah, it's going to change the way, again, that communities are built in. And we know that community, as we've spoken about today and elsewhere, we know that community is so important in beauty. So again, giving them a space, whether that is physically in the barbershop, the salon, the store, wherever, or it is online, those communities and giving them a place to play is the most important. I always think this about the metaverse when we get asked about this, because I think it always gets... Everyone thinks about crypto and NFTs and all these other things with the metaverse and how it may be a bit clunky right now. But I think the gaming industry is always a really interesting thing to look at when you talk about this, because if you look at some of the top games right now, they are games like Roblox or Minecraft or Fortnite. And these games aren't the most, I don't know if either of you are gamers, but these games aren't the most, but these aren't the most aesthetically pleasing games. They're not like the most realistic graphics games. However, it is a place you go.
But the kids go on there and chill with their friends.
To play with your friends. It's all about community. And I know that NARS Cosmetics has already got I think it's 5 or 6 islands in the Roblox game where you can go and you can actually discover within the game of Roblox. You go in and you can discover the islands, which is a different range within their cosmetics line. There's loads of different spaces you can go in. And it's the point I'm making here is that they're not the most aesthetically pleasing games, but it's the community is what becomes really important. So I think that, again, those rules of engagement, whether using tech or not, that becomes really important to know where the consumer's going, because brands are going to have to follow that.
It's true, because I went to a virtual metaverse launch of nail polishes just to kind of find out what it was all about. And admittedly, I did not have great equipment to do it. I was just using my work laptop and my headphones. Before I got lost and ended up in a car park in the metaverse somewhere and couldn't turn around and get back to the launch, it was really striking how people were talking to each other, sending out messages going, "Oh, I really love this. This is really cool," etc. as I wandered around the car park, I just wept a bit of meta tears thinking, I wish I could see it. But it did kind of foster that sense of communal excitement.
There's a sense of anonymity too. There's an element of that when you're doing something digitally, isn't there? Because I mean, that's something that's been talked about quite a bit with like cyberbullying and online bullying, is people feel that they're protected because there's this layer between them and the other person. But I think that also applies in this case too, that you're not in the real world. Everyone's in this sort of, space that they've never been in before. And it's exciting and it's new and everyone's, tinkering around with it. And so the likelihood to engage is going to be significantly higher because you know that everyone's going through, it's like a communal experience that you're all having together and you're kind of all on the same level. And so there's a level of comfort there as well, I think, in being much more open and saying, hey, I'm stuck in the car park, or, oh, this is so cool, or, I'll never go to the metaverse again. This is a nightmare. Like whatever it is, you've got the opportunity to sort of share those experiences because someone else in there is also going through the exact same thing.
Yeah, it's a work in progress as well. Yeah, I think you're right. It's kind of, again, that idea of community and taking people along with you. I think that's really important. It also begs the question as well, Viv, had you gone to an actual physical PR launch, would you have ended up in the car park anyway?
Probably.
Where's Viv? Oh, she's lost again.
Probably. But actually, on the subject of in real life, do you find now that when you go to stores, like if you're going to a big department store in the beauty hall, you're actually kind of more demanding than you used to be in the past because you have this instant fulfillment online, being able to find the information, go from one page to another, etc., read reviews. I do find when I go into department stores, it's like, well, why aren't you talking to me? Why aren't you telling me about your products? Why can't I actually reach these products or try them out or find the prices or, see the headline claims or anything?
We're so used to having such easy access to all that information. Yeah. And now I want the person in the store to almost become this encyclopedia of the same information.
It is a really good point because I think we've spent so long when we think of online worlds and indeed metaverses, when our first thoughts of them, we spend so much of our lives thinking how we replicate the offline online. But actually, when it comes to beauty shopping for the future, it's actually what do we take from the online now that we need to incorporate into the offline? Because as you say, I have the convenience. It's simpler. It's easier sometimes to shop online. So how are you going to bring that to my store, to my physical store? Because I still want to go in and touch and play with the products.
Right. But I want all of that information at the same time.
One of the retail analysts was showing me a sportswear store that's opened in Westfield, where the trainers or sneakers, wherever you're sort of listening to the podcast, they've got RFID attached to them. So you can use your smartphone, click on them, and it'll show you information about the trainer. It'll give you comparisons with other trainers so that you can make more educated choices. So you have that sense of more sort of 360 degrees sales information. Still not getting you an assistant any quicker, but I'm sure that will come.
But I mean, we're so used to sitting in front of our computer and being able to research and read reviews on everything before we buy it. Yeah. So that you're making a much more informed choice. You can do product comparisons. You could, put something out on TikTok asking for advice. There's so many different things that you can do pre-purchase in the digital realm that you then couldn't do when you go into a physical store. Yeah. So again, it's the same sort of a thing is, how many of us search for a product and then spend 4 hours reading every article and every review that you could find, especially for big ticket items, before you decide to actually make that purchase. That's more difficult to do, in an actual store. So thinking about, again, making that part of this sort of journey that the shopper can go on and be able to do those comparisons and get that information.
Yeah, and once you've lost them, you don't get them back. I mean, I'm, me, but grumpy old woman, but there's a couple of brands that I won't buy from because I remember once standing in a beauty hall by a display for what felt like a good 10 minutes waiting for somebody to come and ask me if I wanted any help.
Nobody came.
Nah, just invisible. So I left, and that's it. Never bought from them again. Well, I never bought from them the first time because nobody would tell me about it.
But that's true. There's so much choice out there that you could very easily just switch off one and move on to the next one.
And nowadays as well, that 10 minutes you gave them back then to sort of come and speak to you, it's probably like a minute now or less, because again, the attention span for brands to actually be that engaged with consumers is shorter, because there is this competition for sort of space in the consumer mind. So it does become really important to get it right. And I do think as well, it is a combination of the two. Like Sarah, like you said at the start about it being tech influenced, but also not dependent. Like there is going to be this other element of engagement that becomes really important as well. Unfortunately, that probably does it for today. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I could probably talk with you more for another hour or so, and I probably will off the podcast. But in terms of the actual podcast, that does do it for today. If people want to learn any more about Mintel, or specifically about the trends, the 3 trends that we talked about today, which were the beauty RX trend, which is all looking at the medicalization of beauty, leading to looking at sort of more demand for proof behind claims, validation, ingredient-led products. That's sort of the real key focus of that trend. The evolved self-care trend that we mentioned in the middle, talking about sort of how beauty links so heavily into that well-being driver, but also life stage beauty, how we make people feel. I love that reference earlier as well about being kind, that really coming through in the sort of the different aspects of how brands communicate, but also actually formulate and manufacture the products themselves becomes really important. And then of course the new rules of engagement trend that we've just discussed just then, I'm talking about this whole new disruption that we're seeing in the category around tech-driven, digital, online, offline. The whole rules of engagement have changed, but they are still evolving both online and offline. So it becomes a really important platform to play in. As I say, to learn any more about those trends, please head over to mintel.com, or please reach out to your account managers or any of our analysts or consultant teams as well to find out more about how these could apply to you and to your business. Also, be sure to subscribe to Little Conversation wherever you get your podcasts. But all that's left for me to say is, Viv, Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you very much for your insights. Hopefully you enjoyed your trip on the podcast, Viv.
I did. I think I may have given away too much about my dark side, but never mind.
Never. We certainly enjoyed having you, and we'll definitely have you again in the future. And Sarah, I know this isn't your first time, but thank you very much for joining us today. Hopefully that was a bit of fun for you as well.
Anytime.
Perfect. Well, thank you to you both. As I say, be sure to subscribe to Little Conversation wherever you get your podcasts. But all that's left for me to say is thank you very much and have a good day.